Welcome to another episode on catalyzing radical systemic change, where in my own words, it's all about mapping and cross-pollinating what I think are the necessary building blocks towards a planetary civilization ahead. And I know in the podcast series, I've touched upon the topic of psychedelics time and again, but today we're really going to take a high-level view on exploring the psychedelics ecosystem. And just a couple of words from my side to frame the conversation. With billions of dollars flowing into the market, obviously, most of them are using the same scaffolding and architecture and mechanisms and patterns as normal extractive mainstream capitalism. So as I'm speaking today with you, Marik Hazan, you're founder of Tabula Rasa Ventures and raising an impact investing fund. But I know you're also doing a good chunk of other stuff that we're going to explore throughout the podcast. So my first question today, just why psychedelics at all? Why should we focus on psychedelics where we have all of these doom and gloom scenarios for us collectively as a species? Why the heck psychedelics? You know, and before you give this answer, I know that some of the people in my ecosystem, some of my partners, my business partners, they're rather cautious with the topic, and they're like, why is this not just another like esoteric woo-woo thing? So let's start very high level. Why psychedelics at all? Why should we care?
Definitely. Yeah. So I think that there's kind of like a simple answer, and then there's a longer, more nuanced one. With regards to the simple answer is that simply we have not necessarily seen breakthroughs in health or medicine as significant as we've seen with psychedelic therapeutics in decades of time. Really, the approaches that we currently have for any sort of mental health treatments are quite outdated. Most individuals are still treated with kind of talk therapy or antidepressants, which can be effective for a certain portion of the population. But when you compare it to the efficacy that we're seeing in clinical trials with psychedelic-assisted therapy, there's really not much of a comparison there. These therapeutic compounds are just significantly better at lowering PTSD, depression, anxiety, and a host of other mood disorders. And we're also seeing them be applied in clinical research for many other ailments that people wouldn't even necessarily think to connect to psychedelics. For instance, obesity. You wouldn't necessarily think that psychedelics could somehow help individuals that suffer with obesity, but when you look at obesity as a health problem that stems from the psychology of an individual, actually shifting an individual's psychology through psychedelics first could be a gateway to being able to help someone cure themselves of obesity as well. So that's kind of like the simple answer. And I'm sure over this conversation, we'll get into a more complex and nuanced understanding, but the quick thing that I'll say on kind of the longer and more nuanced answer is I think that these compounds have a really incredible ability to allow for individuals to develop better intergroup synchrony, develop better relationships with one another, and the ability for communities to sync together and build trust with one another, heal together through different things that they might be experiencing, I think is an extremely important foundation and catalyst for being able to solve many of our other existential threats and problems. And so those are the couple reasons why we focus on psychedelics as one of the core foundations of our fund and our investment strategy.
Before we dive into the broader ecosystem of Tabula Rasa Ventures, Energia Foundation, and Psyched Conference, why the name? I mean, it's consciously chosen. Why Tabula Rasa?
Yeah. So it was actually chosen not by myself, but by the first individual that I ever worked with on this project. It was their idea. I had never actually even heard the words tabula rasa before, but once they were described to me, it felt like a perfect fit. It was this great combination of both this blank slate, this new way of doing medicine, this blank slate for the human mind, this ability to start over, and from just kind of a couple kids in their mid-20s seeing that the word tab was secretly hidden in tabula rasa Rasa Ventures was also, quite quirky and fun to witness. So I think it was a combination of different things, but really, it serves as a foundation for, not just how we think about psychedelics as, a treatment for health, which is giving people this blank slate to be able to build their health on top of in this new beginning, but also the way that we want to build venture capital and this firm is we want to build it as a clean slate, really set an example of what venture capital can be, of what for-profit entrepreneurship can be when it is aligned with the principles of multi-stakeholder alignment. And we believe that that is a path that has been successful in creating outcomes, good outcomes for many different groups of people, and not just the individuals who are operating the company and not just the investors who are investing in it, but everyone involved. And so really, this is our shot at a blank slate for not just human health, but also to do business differently and to show that there's a real possibility for that.
Before we dive deeper into, let's say, the nitty-gritty scaffolding infrastructure of how you try to do impact investing differently, and really use that as a blank slate, because I think most people would associate, including myself, venture capital with, like, let's say, the worst phase of capitalism possible. At least I reckon most of the European listeners. Before we dive into that, sketch the ecosystem, like just the genesis, what brought you there, what is the ecosystem, and sketch both like the three-partite, Tabula Rasa, Energia Foundation, and Psyched Conference.
Yeah, so the Psyched Conference lives under the foundation. So I would even say it's kind of like just two entities, is the Energia Foundation and Tabula Rasa is the investment firm. The Psyched Conference was just basically the conference that we grew that really was the first piece of infrastructure that helped us kind of launch many of the things that we're working on. But basically, our own ecosystem is just built from this investment firm, which is a venture firm, a traditional VC firm that does impact investing. And then we have the foundation. And the foundation deploy something that I call D2O advocacy. Most of my background is actually in different sorts of social movements, in different sorts of basically working along the disability rights movement, the interfaith advocacy movement, the sex worker rights movement, the decentralized governance movement, and most recently the psychedelics movement. And so, D2O advocacy is kind of an approach that I saw unfolding in many of these different movements that I was contributing to and participating in, which was basically demonstration to organization, D2O advocacy. So it's basically first you demonstrate, you build up buzz, and through the demonstrations, not only do you build up buzz and kind of get people paying attention to the cause that you're creating, but you also create a really high collision ecosystem for individuals who will be the foundations of that movement to be able to start organizing. So they're able to basically, have conversations that then end up building the organizations that actually lead to long-term impact. So this is actually typically how most social movements evolve. Is typically you have protests, rallies, individuals coming together, doing marches, things like that. People who are really passionate about the cause get colliding there. Other individuals begin talking about the needs, the infrastructural needs for that movement to continue, and then they end up incorporating, 501c3s and different organizations and NGOs and even for-profits to be able to push a movement forward. So that's kind of how our foundation functions. And the conference is one, event that we host, and we host it in conjunction with Davos. So we actually go to Davos and run programming in parallel with the World Economic Forum, looking to basically educate individuals on psychedelic therapeutics, psychedelic-assisted therapy, but even more broadly, future of health and what that can provide. And then our venture firm is, just another piece of the ecosystem outside of the foundation, but they work very closely in tandem. Many of the profits from the VC firm actually go to the foundation. The foundation helps support the VC firm in many ways as well with regards to just educating people on psychedelic therapeutics, which is absolutely necessary if you want to do anything on a for-profit side and build companies around this as well. But yeah, that's, I guess, at least our ecosystem within the broader psychedelics ecosystem. And
when we dive, so let's disentangle just for the possibility to dive deeper. Let's disentangle for a moment the foundation and the VC firm, although they're very closely linked. On the VC side, what are you trying to do differently, from due diligence to vetting to investing into to some of the parts of the profits going into the foundation? how are you trying to uphold with your vision that you're really serving the whole ecosystem and all the stakeholders, and not just creating a solid profit for the very few privileged that are able to invest in the companies?
Yeah, well, I think it starts with kind of the core belief that the only way to actually build resilient organizations and get to long-term profitability is through multi-stakeholder alignment and actually engaging with all different stakeholders. So yes, like you can build a Facebook, you can build an Amazon, and you can do it super, super quickly. And you can scale it and you can have it generate a return. But if you ignore stakeholders, then eventually the trust in that organization is lost. That organization loses the trust of its community, and that community, whether it's the customers, the investors, the individuals that it affects in one way or another, whether those are policymakers or just kind of innocent bystanders, if they don't trust that organization begins to lose power. And so if you're trying to build long-term sustainable organizations, then we believe that multi-stakeholder alignment is absolutely necessary. And again, like you can generate quick returns with many different things. If you want to generate quick returns with a company that's just a shell and IPOs on a Canadian stock exchange and doesn't really have much else outside of, a couple individuals that, put a pitch deck together and had some wealthy friends, you can do that and make money. And we kind of see that and much of the culture of high growth entrepreneurship as not too dissimilar from one another, unfortunately. And so a lot of what we're trying to build instead is, starting with the belief that profitability is only possible, long-term profitability is only possible through multi-stakeholder alignment. The way that we begin to work with companies is really thinking through who are the stakeholders, and what are you actually doing to interact with every one of those stakeholders. And when we see missing pieces, on that map, that could be, indigenous community members, that could be the researchers, the doctors, it could also be the investors. All of those individuals are taken equally into account when we work with a company, and we think through who are you ignoring. And it's not just about serving, one demographic. A lot of folks who, are trying to build organizations that are nonprofits and only take care of, a population that they perceive as struggling, they're ignoring a lot of other stakeholders. And I actually think that that's a really dangerous way to build any type of organization. A lot of the nonprofits that were based in the Amazon ended up doing tremendous harm to communities there because they during COVID, because most of those nonprofits were built around, for instance, ayahuasca tourism and things like that. And even though they had built an economic foundation for indigenous communities there that was helpful, when COVID happened, that tourism left. Those nonprofits had been so focused on indigenous community members and trying to serve them that they didn't do a good job creating any sort of reserves of capital. They had no sorts of for-profit partnerships. They had no sources of revenue. And so their entire economic foundation collapsed, and that ended up hurting many indigenous communities to the point where people were dying because they couldn't get medical treatments. They couldn't get to hospitals. There was no economic foundation for them to feed themselves or their families. So in that approach as well, you can go completely the opposite direction in the nonprofit side. But if you're not thinking through multi-stakeholder alignment and who are the different stakeholders involved, truly all of them, whether you build nonprofit or for-profit, you can get into really dangerous territory and hurt people at the end of the day.
Yeah, let's not go into the dichotomy of for-profit or nonprofit, because I reckon, in both our biographies, we've worked from nonprofit to for-profit to hybrid. How do you try to ensure that you're not just using indigenous wisdom to fig leaf your organizations, to tokenize the indigenous communities? Can you give a couple of very hands-on examples how you try to make a difference there, especially for the examples you have already mentioned?
Yeah. So myself, for instance, I'm not an expert in, indigenous communities and indigenous cultures. That is just not what I have studied, what I have known. I know many people who are, but I am not someone who is an expert in that. And so when I think through the type of relationship that myself or our organization should really have with indigenous communities, I think that it's one that needs to be more mindful than just like, oh, hey, these, indigenous communities, we need to send them all this money or like do this or that, or try to help through force instead of helping through kind of deep listening of what's actually necessary. So when we were doing a stakeholder analysis of different stakeholders that are involved within the psychedelics ecosystem, what we actually realized is that the place of our organization to best be able to help indigenous community members was not necessarily one where we were flying out to Peru and like, handing out donations or trying to build infrastructure. For us, it was about, first off, trying to empower more individuals that were actual experts within the psychedelics community and were already interfacing with indigenous community members. And that was done through a combination of promoting different organizations and individuals through a Psyched Conference, bringing different individuals from those communities to Davos to be able to speak on their own behalf without us speaking for them, and also bringing individuals into our incubator and accelerator programs that were building organizations that were specifically focused on helping indigenous communities. And so for us, that was like the approach that we took and are still taking, is how do we find the experts that actually know how to interface with indigenous communities and work with them to be able to support them in building the infrastructure that's necessary? Because us ourselves, like, we can throw money at any problem we want to, but at the end of the day, that's not going to necessarily move the needle on what's needed. So that was kind of one thing that kind of came out of that, is really finding the brilliant people and allowing for them to support their own communities. And I'm happy to provide a bunch of links of different organizations that we believe in and support, to be featured in the podcast. Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund, much of the work of Jesse Hudson, I think, is really important to pay attention to. And there's a few other, Beyond is another group that I think is doing some great work out in West Africa. So there's a lot of interesting organizations that are doing meaningful work. Chacruna, ICEERS, and many other, that the list can go on and on. And so what I would basically encourage folks to do is, think through who are the experts. And if you find yourself not a true expert, not having spent a decade within a discipline, then find the individuals who are and spend time trying to figure out how to support them. And that's really a lot of what our work has been with regards to at least indigenous community support, more so than kind of direct relationship building, which we've oftentimes seen unfold in a more harmful than helpful way for folks we've seen engage in that way without necessarily knowing how to engage appropriately.
Davos. We're recording this before you fly to Davos. Why Davos from your side? I think Davos is a double-edged sword, to say the least. For some people in their filter bubble, it's devil incarnate. For the other ones, these are the people who are going to save the planet. So where are you positioning yourself? How do you nuance your focus, your capacity? Why do you put such an emphasis on Davos?
Yeah. So, I think that Davos is tricky. It's a really tricky place for a lot of different reasons. But maybe not necessarily the reasons people would think. I think in the psychedelics movement, in kind of the new wave consciousness movement, and this kind of relates to some of these conversations we've already been having today, there's kind of like, I'm sure you've heard, maybe you haven't, of like the drama or trauma triangle. I don't know if that's a framework that's familiar to you, right? And it's like the hero, villain, and the victim. And when we look at large scale social movements, this is something that happens constantly, is like there are, a collective group of people is just a scaled up neural network of combined individuals. It works very similarly to how a brain works in practice. And so when you have an individual who villainizes someone who they believe is hurting them and painting them as the villain in their drama triangle, you see the same thing with social movements. And so individuals who are maybe anti-capitalist or are coming from a lens of like, capital or extraction or power of any sort can really hurt the world, they're going to paint whatever that other body is, especially if they don't necessarily know people who are there, as kind of the villains of that story. And that's actually how they'll oftentimes build momentum. Is one really key way in social movements of building trust is the common enemy. It's actually a very effective strategy in the short term, but very ineffective in the long term. But in the short term, the common enemy, or the villain, is a great way for building trust and mobilizing people. And so I think that with Davos, that seems to be what a lot of folks are walking away with, is, they're looking at Davos, they're seeing a lot of the, potential harm that could come from individuals that have this much power. For us, what we see a bunch of individuals who, range on a gradient of self-awareness with regards to what they are currently doing and what they could do more of to be able to make the world a better place. Some are completely clueless. Some are like really in tune. There's actually a good percentage of people who go to Davos. So there's like a 10 to 15% of the Davos community that is this kind of like consciousness undercurrent and is really fueling a lot of like the most important impact efforts around the world right now. You know, this is not just the people who are running, you know, the biggest for-profit organizations, but they're also individuals who are making really deep impact in local regions that are coming there and speaking on these stages. And so there's a lot of different types of folks there that are important to engage with. And so for us, when we go to Davos, we try to spend our time engaging with individuals who are receptive to new ways of thinking, to moving the world in a direction that we see as being beneficial. I think also a lot of the Davos community is disappointed in itself. You know, I think a lot of the Davos crowd wants better for Davos, wants Davos to do more for the world than it's currently done, is really trying to push it forward. And so I think it's, you know, it is a double-edged sword in some ways, but I think at the end of the day, what's important is like when we're engaging with Davos or when we're engaging with the communities we come back to, that we're not going through the process of like villainizing anyone. Instead, we're just really deeply listening and understanding, okay, like this is the person's context. This is how they frame their system. These are the stakeholders that they're not in contact with. These are the stakeholders that they are in contact with. And this is maybe why they're missing certain pieces of this puzzle. How do we help more effective collisions happen so that people who don't necessarily have as holistic exposure to different stakeholders, how do we make collisions happen where more people can get more exposure to different types of thought and mentality and understand where people are coming from? And those types of collisions really can help a movement be significantly healthier because people understand each other's concerns and then can build much more resilient infrastructure with one another instead of tearing each other apart and, you know, playing a competitive game where there's really no winner. And so that's kind of how we've tried to approach Davos, and you know, we'll continue going and seeing how effective we are in, you know, championing this ideology of multi-stakeholder alignment as we garner presence there.
Let's again link the foundation and the fund. So you're in the process of raising the first fund, but you're also already deploying funds. Can you give not maybe 10, but 2 or 3 or 4 examples that excite you where you're deploying funds or planning on deploying funds, and why specifically both the way you deploy the funds does not just create more extractive business models, as well as then how the fund directly connects to the foundation?
Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, there's definitely a lot to kind of like speak to on that front. With the fund, so there was actually a fund 0 before. So we actually already deployed capital from just investor networks into around 26 opportunities and really helped build some of the beginning infrastructures of, you know, what's beginning to become a more impact-driven psychedelics ecosystem. But with, you know, this current fund that is our own capital that we're beginning to deploy from investors that are trusting us to deploy this capital, the types of opportunities that we've been lucky to, you know, invest in and the entrepreneurs we've been lucky to work with, we believe are building essential infrastructure for this movement to not only succeed, but to be heralded in the safest, best way possible. So for instance, you know, one of the companies that we invested in is a company called WavePass. They are specifically focused on the music experience of psychedelic assisted therapy. So what you might think from, you know, being a psychonaut is that like music is powerful, clearly. But when it comes to clinical settings and it comes to diverse patient populations, the same playlist that you would think would have the same outcomes for a multitude of different people could actually harm someone in the clinical setting or in a therapeutic setting. Someone who maybe associates this type of music with this type of demographic or with this type of trauma that they've experienced could actually experience re-traumatization just based on the music that they're exposed to in a therapeutic setting. Whereas on the other side, a highly calibrated musical playlist could actually produce someone with unparalleled results and help them move through the trauma that they're facing, help them process things, etc. So things, because we are so not just vulnerable, but so sensitive in the psychedelic state, just small tweaks in music can have completely different outcomes depending on the patients that they're actually related with. And so while yes, like we can maybe build an amazing, thriving recreational or, kind of underground going to above ground psychedelic ecosystem, there are certain things and certain outcomes that we're actually not able to access just because different people in different settings and different communities with different contexts are maybe not going to benefit as much from one type of thinking or one type of approach. And as the psychedelic space becomes more and more diverse, has more people from immigrant backgrounds, has more backgrounds from different minority groups, has different individuals coming from different socioeconomic statuses entering into the psychedelic space and experiencing psychedelic healing, what we're seeing is that the results differ vastly. And a lot of it is related to who your therapist is, what is your set and setting, is your experience context appropriate, what type of care are you getting before and after, and all of these different types of things. And so those are the things that we're really trying to hedge for and make sure that we're providing to folks. Another company that we just invested in that we're super excited about is the first company to do health insurance for psychedelic assisted therapy. Psychedelic assisted therapy, if you're working with psilocybin, if that's an 8-hour experience and you need 2 therapists there, a male and a female typically, to be able to make sure that whoever the individual is that's going through this therapy is having the best possible experience just based on the clinical data. That's 2 therapists in a room for 8 hours, and you need multiple sessions like that. Plus you need preparation and you need integration. If you want to make sure that this ecosystem is fair for the therapists that are doing important work, they need to be compensated. And for them to be compensated for that much time to be able to work with someone, you need a significant amount of cash to be able to support those therapists working on this. One way to do that is insurance reimbursement. And there's other models as well, community-based models that we're currently working with and things like that. But insurance is essential if you want access. There's no way to do access to psychedelic therapy without paying attention to insurance. And so that's another example of a company that we're super excited about and think is essential to the future of psychedelics and access to psychedelic medicines. I think that there's many more that we could go through. On the drug development side, a lot of people have questions about how do you do drug development in psychedelics? Like, all these psychedelics already work. Why would we want to patent compounds, extract from these communities, et cetera, et cetera? Well, when it comes to drug development, it's way more complex than just, hey, we already have these compounds that are working for us. Different compounds work mechanistically differently in people's bodies, minds, brains, et cetera. And so there are specific compounds that we can actually tweak and improve upon. For instance, MDMA. What does it look like to design MDMA without the crash the next day? That's a really big question to ask, and something that scientists who develop that should be rewarded for. But also, how do we design molecules that maybe don't necessarily facilitate a psychedelic experience because the type of illness that a person is experiencing, it's unethical to actually put them into a psychedelic state if they're to experience that. So for instance, that could be someone with bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, or someone who just doesn't necessarily want to be in a psychedelic state, someone that is preferring not to do that because of their religious background, or because they have something like traumatic brain injury, which is a completely different ailment. So all of these different complexities of individuals, it's not just, oh, hey, we can put anyone in a psychedelic state and they can benefit. There's still an advantage to taking psychedelics that activate, the 2A receptor in people's brains, but don't necessarily have the psychedelic experience, but have all of these other effects that happen and can possibly heal things like inflammation and immune system disorders and things like obesity, like I mentioned before, central nervous system types of issues and things like that. And so there's a whole field of drug development that now we're not just opening up this class of different consciousness experiences, we're opening up this whole new class of compounds that can actually heal people pharmacologically based on people's biochemistry, neurochemistry, and having different effects on their bodies that heal them from their disorders. So just kind of a general overview of drug development and why it's important in this space as well.
After the overall overview from your side, let's get a dash nerdy, because I reckon, at least to some of the listeners, that's really interesting. So as most listeners will know, throughout most cultures, psychedelic compounds have been used. So there's anything from magic mushrooms to ayahuasca to the cacti with mescaline, peyote, and San Pedro. There's synthetic compounds like LSD and ketamine. There's lesser known, let's say, heavy hitters like 5-MeO-DMT. So from a fund perspective, let's take a long-term view, because I reckon, much as myself, you're pretty substance agnostic. Yet it seems some of the substances mentioned, out of which some come from an indigenous cultural heritage background, such as ayahuasca, for example, or also peyote and San Pedro would be good examples, or psilocybin, like the magic mushrooms. What are the compounds that you think, and in what sequence, will become legal, and for what reasons?
Mm-hmm. So I think that we're going to see, I mean, psilocybin is already being kind of decriminalized in a lot of different places in the US and has been already legalized in Oregon for therapeutic use. So I think psilocybin is probably going to be the first front runner in kind of more of the recreational movement, or at least the state-by-state movement in the US. I think MDMA will be the first legalized for therapeutic use outside of ketamine and MDMA, not traditional psychedelics, but still in that class, at least therapeutically. So I think that those, ketamine has been already available not only in the US, but around the globe in ketamine clinics for, decades of time, and yields many extremely effective, results for individuals who have different mental health or mood disorders, and effects is as effective as traditional psychedelics, depending on what you're using it for and depending on the patient. But MDMA will likely roll out, probably by the end of this year, 2023, or by the end of 2024 at the latest, based on the clinical data that we've received back just in the last couple of weeks. And so that's super exciting. And then psilocybin state by state, I think that like all plant-based compounds, that's kind of been a movement in the US, is like specifically plant-based psychedelic molecules. So that could include, the cacti, anything botanical, really, psilocybin, mushrooms, ayahuasca, sassafras, etc., would, for instance, not any longer be criminalized. And so I think that we're going to see more of, instead of a per molecule based movement, we're also kind of seeing a plant-based movement first. And then I think that we'll see more of a synthetic movement later on. But it's really difficult to tell once we start hitting like kind of the end of the legalize plant medicine type of movement. We've had a lot of conversations on how it might unfold. There's kind of a possibility that because there's hundreds of different psychedelic molecules, what we might see is kind of just like you would go into a cannabis shop and have a bunch of different strains of cannabis that all provide slightly different effects. What we might see, 15 years down the road, is that we have, similar stores specifically for psychedelics, but instead of THC strains, we have different psychedelic molecules. And we have hundreds of these different psychedelic molecules, and we go up to the person at the counter and say, hey, I'm experiencing these types of things. I'm looking for a psychedelic that can help me with this and has this mood profile, et cetera, et cetera. So we might see kind of the I don't even know what the word would be, strainization of psychedelic molecules as kind of a parallel to what's happening with cannabis right now. But every psychedelic is super different. I'm sure that we will see, with psilocybin coming online, with mushrooms coming online the way that they have in the last few years, we will probably see a very strong mimicking of cannabis with the psilocybin or the mushroom movement, at least in some ways. And then I think other compounds soon to follow with from the plant perspective. The big battle in the US right now is kind of it's super interesting. It's between researchers, therapists, and doctors, and citizens themselves. And that battle is actually not necessarily even over a specific molecule, but more specifically for microdosing. So in the legislation, wherever we've seen it be pushed forward, typically what citizens are asking for is citizens really want microdosing to be approved. They want to be able to have access to microdosing. They want to be able to microdose. But when you look at the research and you look at what the researchers, therapists, doctors are saying, is that the evidence is still inconclusive on microdosing. And really the clinical data is all behind high dose therapeutic sessions with these specific compounds. And so there's this interesting battle where the people who should typically know the most about psychedelics are basically saying maybe not microdosing yet, Whereas the people who are just kind of citizens and are just pushing for policy to change as quickly as possible, like, no, we want microdosing. And so we'll have to see how that unfolds. But I think also there's going to be, depending on the dosage dependent policy that might evolve that didn't necessarily for cannabis, which I think is a really good thing because since there is no dosage dependent policies that are, super like well known in cannabis, it's like so many cannabis products are so highly dosed with THC that I think people are actually having more negative experiences than they need to be these days. Just more paranoia and more possibly even like worse consequences of that. So I think that will hopefully be prevented in the psychedelic space.
Just maybe for a minute or two, with the funds that you hope to receive and the funds you want to deploy, and having talked now about the range of substances possible, are there a couple of bets that you with the venture arm, so to say, with Tabula Rasa Ventures want to take? And if so, which?
So like which compounds specifically? Yeah, so I think that different pools of capital are appropriate for different types of businesses. And I actually think that, VC is not really appropriate for trying to support a lot of the kind of original compounds. I don't think, LSD, MDMA, psilocybin, et cetera, are going to necessarily benefit from VC dollars. I think they can benefit from consumer dollars, from small businesses, and from philanthropic funding. But I don't think that venture capital's funds are necessarily meant for those compounds. And the reason why is because, first off, those compounds aren't patentable. And so therefore, the return profile on them from a VC perspective is not as great. But secondly, because they're not patentable, if you really are trying to put VC dollars into these first generation molecules, there's other things that you have to compromise on if you're not going to, have the patents. You're going to have to basically really be able to grow revenue quickly. And I think that is actually what fuels the perverse incentives, is when people are putting VC capital into opportunities that are not appropriate for VC capital. So if you're putting in millions of dollars into a psilocybin startup and you have no patents to go off of and you have no return in that way, your LPs, your investors of the VC are going to be pushing you to make that company grow, acquire customers at any cost, scale at any cost, et cetera, which you're going to end up compromising your patients at the end of the day. So there's a place for patents. There's a place not for patents. There's a place for VC capital. There's a place for consumer capital. There's a place, for every one of these types of things. And so for us, what we're really looking at least from the VC fund, and the foundation is a completely different story. But from the VC side, we're looking to support compounds that are super novel, that are stemming from kind of the psychedelic class, and are inspired by the psychedelic class of molecules and are maybe activating the 2A receptor, but are completely different in what they can treat, what they can do, have a completely different efficacy profile depending on the treatment, and maybe are even more effective than traditional psychedelic compounds for a specific ailment. And that's kind of what we're most interested in, at least deploying into with the VC funds. But in terms of the foundation, in terms of our personal lives, we are big kind of supporters of the first generation compounds, both in terms of policy and making sure policy gets passed so people have access, making sure that organizations get built that can support this stuff, making sure that whether it's through a church or through a small business or through retreat centers or through indigenous community support, that many of these first generation compounds have a healthy ecosystem that exists around them as well, without needing to rely on venture capital to be able to fund them and force them to scale super quickly.
Thanks. For me, that was really helpful because for everyone not in the sector, there's just a broad variety of capital. VC capital, in a way, needs to serve a certain pattern, right? So I don't know how deep we want to dive into that, but when I was listening in, I had the feeling you were referring to other funds that were acquiring a lot of money, not necessarily to the benefit of possible future customers or other aspects where psychedelic compounds might have a beneficial effect. So I wonder how you're nuancing and positioning yourself with raising the fund with the other funds raised, and if that helps the listeners to sketch that.
Yeah, definitely. I know it might be hard to sympathize or empathize with the VC, but I think it's really important to do so that we understand how we can actually change venture and make it way better. And I think that paying attention to the problems that VCs face and being able to both raise and deploy capital can give us a lot of insight, and have been a humongous educational experience for me to understand how we can actually transform business as a whole. So when VCs are raising this capital, there's a few things, and especially in the psychedelic space, one of the biggest issues over the last few years, there were two main issues. One is that there really weren't that many psychedelics deals. There were, the standard winners that everyone is betting against. That means that these VCs are competing to put their money into these few select deals. Their valuations, these entrepreneurs, especially in the hot market that was around over the last 2 years, are able to inflate their valuations significantly. This ends up destabilizing the entire market because these companies become overvalued. There's too few deals to invest in. When the economy collapses, all these companies have to have down rounds. They're less likely to garner investment. That means that many more companies fail, entrepreneurs die, and eventually the customers don't actually get the product that they're looking for. So there's a lot of kind of problems there. And so through the psychedelic, the beginnings of the psychedelic ecosystem, because so many of these investors were kind of coming from traditional, like they were tech investors or cannabis investors, et cetera, they weren't really spending the time to get to know the psychedelics ecosystem. So they weren't picking up on the earlier stage opportunities. They weren't necessarily finding more holistic ways of investing in the ecosystem. They were basically betting on the same few bets. And many of them have very similar overlapping portfolios now, which is in itself a problem. That has kind of created this fragility in the market. What we've tried to do in the ways that we've tried to separate ourselves with regards to how we invest and how we deploy capital, outside of kind of just the impact lens and from just a strategic finance lens as well, is that we're looking at super early stage companies. We're looking at pre-seed companies, seed stage companies, and we know how to develop and grow those companies much more effectively than other VCs in the space. I've been helping incubators and accelerators grow over the last 10 years as well, outside of just the advocacy work that I've been doing. And so I've worked with hundreds of early stage entrepreneurs, and some of those entrepreneurs have built nonprofits, for-profits, NGOs, et cetera. But I know what early stage companies and organization building looks like and the biggest pitfalls of it, and how do you actually spot an entrepreneur that's going to deliver over 2 years of time, 3 years of time. And it might be a really slow, ramp up. They might really they might be finishing school. They might be, taking care of family. They might have just had a new kid. But how do you know like who's actually in it? What do you look for, et cetera? And then how do you help them build something that is long lasting? And so those are some of the things that we've really paid attention to. So we have some of the better deal flow in the space that we've been able to send to kind of partners and financiers that we also work with and are values aligned with our own VC. And so that's been great to work on. We've also structured our portfolio much more holistically. At the beginning, and back in 2018 and 2019, I was saying is like, the space is not just drug development. It's not just about the drug. There's a therapy involved. There's an entire infrastructure to build here. There's going to be health insurance companies and clinic systems and all these things that we need to pay attention to. And so from the beginning, we've been really trying to pay attention and deploy in a way that is holistic for the space. So looking at more than just the drug development, but looking at all of the infrastructure that's necessary to make sure that the psychedelic ecosystem is healthy and thriving. And so I think that, those kind of things, looking at earlier stage companies, looking at the ecosystem more holistically, we've been able to fit the appropriate capital to the right opportunities, have access to better deal flow, and at the same time, not completely increase valuations to some ridiculous amount where then you end up with a fragile market that can't really survive and can't do anything good for the end customer at the end of the day, and have to close down shop, have to sell their companies prematurely, have to IPO prematurely, which was something we saw a bunch. And so those types of things as well. So yeah.
I reckon we both agree that the market potential for both recreational use and treatment in the space of psychedelics is close to infinite. I mean, not infinite, but we're talking multi-billion-dollar market opportunities. where in the different segments of the, let's say, fund one, but more on a horizon two, so in the next like 3 to 5 years, do you see the biggest potential?
Yeah, I think the folks who are looking at this as part of a larger movement, which is both future of health as well as strengthening distrust in our current health systems, I think the opportunities that serve from those two angles as well as psychedelics are going to have some success, some greater success. And so those are a lot of the opportunities that we're looking at. So for instance, health insurance for psychedelic assisted therapy is super exciting for us because it's not just about health insurance for psychedelic assisted therapy. It's also health insurance for many alternative modalities that are just going through, clinical trials, but, maybe whether it's yoga or exercise or food as medicine or sexual health or stem cell therapy, et cetera, maybe haven't made it all the way through the FDA, but are super promising with the anecdotal evidence and some of the citizen data that we have collected on this type of stuff. So those, I think, are going to be, some of the things that we're at least most excited about and think will have the most success. And then I think just like really focused, really high performing teams that, live and breathe psychedelics. We've had a lot of entrepreneurs who come to us and are like, I love psychedelics. I want to build this drug development company on, around this psychedelic molecule. But they don't really have any drug development experience. They've never really ran a company before. They don't necessarily have a good team around them, et cetera. And maybe they're passionate, but they're also not necessarily experienced, and they might not necessarily be as thoughtful as someone who's gone through this journey before, understands kind of the intricacies and the nuance of it. And so sometimes we believe that this is someone who's coachable, someone who, if we work with for the next 3 years, maybe they're not ready to start a company today, but 3 years from now they will be, and that'll be a really great company that gets built. Sometimes we don't think that they're coachable, and it's just not a fit for us necessarily. But when we see passion, when we see coachability, when we see true focused work and really moving the needle on something, we're typically pretty eager to work with that individual because we to get to the point where we were able to open up our fund, it took around 4 years of work. It took, us building the Psyched Conference and us starting this first incubator and us, going to Davos and us being able to do all of these other things to build infrastructure for the space and connecting investors to entrepreneurs for years of time before this fund was able to get off of the ground. That's not the case for most VCs. Most VCs, they're coming from wealth. They're, either multi-generational Americans or, have significant access through capital through their network. Both Maria and I, who currently run the fund, we were born outside the country. Our families, still to this day struggle economically in many ways. And so for us to build this and to get this to a point, it's taken a much longer time. And but at the same time, we know that what we're doing is much more high quality than most other funds because we've had to be much more high quality. We've had to dig into the details. We haven't been able to take shortcuts. We don't have $1 million to just, waste on an opportunity, or even 100,000 to waste, because every penny is being entrusted to us, and, we're trying to win the trust of our own investors as well. And so we have to play a much more careful game, but that also makes us much more focused and intelligent, I think, on how we play this game and how we actually deploy capital into the space.
Let's dive, I think, in the last 2 questions. When you were mentioning the coordination challenge, which I think, beautifully binds together that podcast from the beginning to the end, from this, like, why psychedelics anyhow? So I started my whole career in sustainability, working from all sorts of companies and nonprofit organizations. So people would usually say, okay, we have climate change, we have species dying, we have plastic pollution in the ocean, we now have the Ukraine war, we have women's rights issues. So how the heck, where do psychedelics fit into that puzzle, and how does that solve the coordination challenge?
Yeah, so the coordination challenge is just something that we define as the challenge with humanity being able to coordinate and solve some of the largest existential threats we face today. And a successful solution to the coordination challenge would see depolarization of individuals, and it doesn't even have to necessarily be collaboration or cooperation. It just needs to be enough depolarization that we know that this group is working on a solution, this other group is working on a solution, and they're able to coordinate around each other's approaches. Even if they disagree with one another, that's okay. They have respect for the way that they're trying to approach the solution to this issue. Both groups are gathering data and trying to make sure that they're working towards the most effective solution possible. And so really what it comes down to with regards to the coordination challenge is, how do we actually help individuals and humanity depolarize and build enough trust to be able to coordinate to solve some of these largest existential threats? Because we can have a million Davos conferences on climate change, but until there's agreement on us focusing on this particular thing and us being heads down with it, or communities around the globe supporting whatever it is that they want to support instead of butting heads and villainizing one another, we're not going to be able to coordinate enough to solve some of these large issues. We're going to continue to play a zero-sum game where we are too busy trying to tear down who we believe is a threat instead of trying to focus on solving these existential threats through the solution that we believe is most possible. To be able to coordinate, we need to be able to depolarize humanity. And to depolarize humanity and to build intergroup synchrony, what we need to be able to do is find systemic ways of helping individuals develop trust and build trust for one another. Now, this is something that is like super easily kind of said, and you can see it on local levels, and people build trust in families, communities, etc. It can even be difficult there. But how do you actually scale it is a systems-wide approach? How do you scale depolarization through a systems-wide approach? What we believe the answer to that is through the healthcare system. We believe that when you look at a human mind, you can actually see that human mind reflected in the crowd as well, in the collective conscious. So, for instance, when you look at an individual's either incongruence or disassociation from themselves, or any sort of basically difference in their internal and external presentation of themselves, you can also see that same type of dynamic in the collective conscious. You can see that through polarization. There's a famous anecdote of Steve Jobs as he was building Apple. Kind of there's these being two buildings, one with engineers and one with artists, and this like kind of unification of channels or opening of channels between these two to be able to work together and collaborate. And we can actually see this as right and left brain being able to come together. And this is, happening in not just kind of a theoretical lens, but we literally are these, kind of neural nets that are able to communicate with one another and able to scale our neural nets into these large connective neural systems that do function as brains in one way or another. So when we're looking to depolarize the planet, one thing that we have to ask is, how do we look at the collective conscious as a brain of its own, and how do we begin to build interconnections that help that brain depolarize? How do we help do that for the collective in the same way that we're doing it for the individual? And what is amazing about psychedelics is that they're really great for doing this for the individual, but they can also be used to do this for the collective. And when we look at many different applications of psychedelic therapy, they are done in a community, whether that's underground, whether that's in indigenous communities, or whether in novel research institutes that we're seeing pop up today. Community formats for psychedelic therapy and psychedelic experiences are not just more affordable and solve the affordability challenge that we were talking about before, but they also have the potential to be able to actually decrease polarization between different groups. So there's some amazing research that's being done with Israelis and Palestinians drinking ayahuasca together. There's some amazing research that's being done between Black Lives Matter activists and the NYPD being able to sit in psychedelic ceremony together. And so if we can actually begin to treat the collective conscious as part of our current health system, and begin to transform our health system to more community-based initiatives, then not only are we actually moving the needle on individual health outcomes, we're moving the needle on the health of the collective conscious, and therefore a depolarization that can lead to more solutions for the coordination challenge. And so what we're hoping to accomplish over the next decade with our work is, yes, we're starting with psychedelics, but as distrust in organizations like the FDA and other health systems grow, what we're hoping to reorient towards is, how do we build better healthcare systems that address health through the lens of the community and be able to both solve individual health issues as well as communal health issues that result in the depolarization of people and the coordination challenge. And knowing that that's the responsibility of our health systems, treating the communal mind instead of a bunch of advocacy groups or a bunch of nonprofits that are just trying to get people to get along, that it's a foundational part of our health systems to be able to take on this responsibility, depolarize the world, and leave humanity in a healthier communal state. So that's why we think psychedelics are key to that evolution of health systems.
I feel it's beautiful to add a personal note. Did you ever sit in a classical peyote ceremony with the Virarica?
Not with peyote. I've sat with San Pedro. But
okay, I tell you what the classical indigenous setting of the guardians of the peyote is. You sit around a fire in silence, you dance, you meditate, but you also speak to the fire. And this is usually done a whole village setting. So it's like 50 people, 80 people or something like that. And on the fire, you confess your sins. So it's actually very interesting from a modern scientific standpoint of view that they're combining collective psychotherapy. Literally, you're praying to the fire and saying, I'm sorry because I cheated on my wife with XYZ. Or I'm confessing I had a relapse with my alcohol problems. I confess I again want to let go of alcohol in front of the whole group. So I know it's just anecdotal from my own experience. And I also only know the setting from the Virarica or the Huichol, the traditional guardians of the peyote in Mexico, where we're regularly just organizing ceremonies. Let's come to the last question. I asked that very specific question to a good chunk of people in the podcast, usually people less in the VC space and more people, that work as shamans and therapists. So one of the biggest challenges I see with psychedelic, like with the third wave of psychedelics and the ubiquitous possibility to buy them like anywhere in the web and any metropolitan region. So we suddenly are in a situation where kind of hundreds of millions of people are doing that every year. Mm-hmm. And especially in the space of Silicon Valley, burner communities, this again, just my very own observation, instead of often the healing, humbling, hero dose, transpersonal, cutting through your egoic construction breakthrough moment, I see a lot of supercharged egos. So actually people that I would say they think they're very conscious, I would say they're woke, and they're quenching the last bit of efficiency, ingenuity to build more extractive business models in very mainstream corporate environments. So I would say in my own understanding as a, spiritual activist, or I come from a contemplative background and long, like many years, like 15 years, did only meditate before I even tried any psychedelic, is and I know this is not a VC question. Maybe it's a personal question or a question towards like the foundation you're building. How do we make sure that at the same time we want to proliferate the safe use of psychedelics and the healing potential, making sure it's done with the adequate protocols, so to say, but how can we get rid of more supercharged egos? Because I really think that's a huge problem, right?
Yeah. I actually, I hesitate to believe that psychedelics, have the inherent ability to like reduce ego for the long term. I think that different people have different ways that they actually experience psychedelics. And in fact, when you have such a kind of discombobulation of the default mode network, if your brain is, trying to get back to normalcy, then what you might actually have is a strengthening of your kind of egoic center. And, you can see this. There's, many individuals who come out of psychedelic experiences believing that they're prophets or the reincarnation of Jesus, et cetera. So, it can work in the opposite way. I tend to think of psychedelics as, they're amplifiers and non-specific amplifiers. I think this is Stan Grof's was his kind of terminology around it. I subscribe to that as well. I think that they amplify, and I think that in the state of amplification, we have the ability to see the amplified state in a more visceral way and do something about it. But depending on what we do about it, we can have completely different outcomes. And I think that with regards to specifically on the tone of humility and lowering ego, I don't think that that's really possible without being in strong community for long periods of time. Because when you don't have community where you mess up in front of people and you make mistakes in front of people, it's very difficult to become humbled. If you consistently are building the narrative of yourself succeeding every day and not allowing for your community to kind of have a communal memory of how you've grown or where you've made mistakes and how you're seeking retribution for that in one way or another. And I think that as we grow into a more individualist world, it becomes more difficult for us to stay humble because we're getting more removed from our communities. We're getting more removed from the witnesses in our lives, seeing us grow, seeing us make mistakes, holding on to that communal memory of where we've been and where we're going. And when we're aware of that communal memory, when we're aware of kind of, how we have been perceived and how we've grown in community, still by people who love us, you don't want to be surrounded by people who are going to take advantage of the fact that you've made mistakes, especially on a consistent basis, or terrorize you over it. But if you're surrounded by people that love you and have that communal memory and can almost, poke fun at, this is kind of where you've been and this is where you've come, I think that we can begin to develop a lot more humility. Because actually I have a talk right after this with just a session with a good friend of mine, and we were talking about, we had come from a very meaningful community-based experience, an event that was shared among a small community in Austin, Texas, that was basically about how musical improv can really help improve therapeutic outcomes. And one of the things that we ended up really jamming on, kind of looking back at that event the next day or a couple of days after, was for instance, something as silly as, roast culture. Is we came from this event where everyone was oh my gosh, you did amazing and you did amazing and that was so good. And you did this and this and that. And almost this, overwhelming amount of positivity and affirmation, but not necessarily a honesty or authenticity with how things actually made us feel, almost an overperformance of the impact that someone might have had on us as they performed or as they shared. And so we started talking about roast culture, something that, I feel is familiar to any middle schooler, is when you're sitting at a lunch table, and especially for guys, I would say, is making fun of one another, sometimes in a little bit painful ways, but oftentimes in comedic ways where you're also making your entire community laugh. Right? It's it can definitely be pushed too far, 100%. But having a healthy roast culture where we're kind of teasing one another, playing with one another, being I know you think you're hot shit, but really check yourself for a second, I think is actually super important for that humbling process. And I don't think enough of us have that. And I don't think that we're actually moving towards that with the communities that we're currently building in the consciousness community, in the burner community. I think what we're doing is we're actually just saying, you're amazing, I love you no matter what, you're perfect no matter what. And yes, it can make us feel good or whatever, but first off, it doesn't feel authentic a lot of the time. And I think that actually makes communities fall apart when they don't feel that authenticity. But secondly, we're actually losing the opportunity to jab each other a little bit for the good of the community and the good of ourselves, staying humble and being able to laugh with our communities about we are just all human and we are just moving through this together. So just a couple of thoughts there of what it might take to move towards a more humble world.
I actually think you have an amazing opportunity to think through with me and the whole ecosystem how your access to millions of people through Psyched could build, I would use the word Sangha, from a classical Buddhist context, but it simply means community. What does a values-aligned psychedelic community that strives towards personal development, healing, digging through our traumas actually look like, that provoke the jabs that make us humble? Because at least in my deepest friendships, what is more healthy? Sure, if I have a bad time and I have a shoulder to lean on and get a word to lift me up, that's one thing. But I personally feel it's often the jabs and people, that are critical, like that love me, but that are critical because
Right.
Despite or on top of the supercharged egos, I see a very flawed quality in the market. We see, just making an odd number, I don't know, 100 people making their first psychedelic experience every year. Maybe it's 50 million, nobody really knows, but it's tens of millions of people. And then you have people leading ayahuasca ceremonies or bufo ceremonies or San Pedro ceremonies that have done themselves 20 ceremonies. They have not undergone the scrutiny of apprenticeship that they would need to do in a classical monastic context or in a university context. I mean, we can bash the whole university thing, but I mean, you have to go to school, then you have to go to university, you have to acquire a PhD, and then you're allowed to do brain surgery. And now we have like so many coaches and people out there who like host psychedelic experiences that I would say at best are like in early to mid apprenticeship, but they're no way near mastery. Anyhow, how do we end this? I feel I'm called, what's the moonshot for your ecosystem? I don't really mind a 3, 5 year or 10-year perspective. What's your moonshot to really make a difference, to be a piece in the puzzle to solve the coordination problem? That would be one thing. And the other thing, maybe for the overall psychedelic ecosystem, when we look in 2032 and we listen to that podcast and we are lucky, right? And we made a difference and we survived, financial bottom line or successful or multiple funds raised, what's your moonshot there?
Yeah, for me, the moonshot, kind of like in terms of what we're building, I think is like we'd love to, whether it's us kind of building our own jurisdiction over time or kind of being a support system for other jurisdictions that begin to pop up. I think we're big believers that, network states, autonomous jurisdictions, charter cities will really begin to pop up over the next 15 years in quite significant ways as people begin to kind of leave current political systems and look for something different. A lot of what we're trying to do is build the health infrastructure for that, so that when you are arriving to a new political domain or a legacy system, that your entry into that is as fluid as possible and is as health optimized, both in the immediate term as well as the long term. So what that could possibly look like is you're arriving to this new nation state, call it nation state X, that has just popped up, has 10,000 citizens. You're actually flying in, you're paired with, a community of individuals that will kind of be your first year group to be able to support one another, or possibly afterwards, you might be sitting in ceremony with different individuals. You're able to optimize health through XYZ types of technologies that are available there, and are also scalable to that population. There's, specific rituals, cultural elements that really help people stay health optimized or considerate, and also depolarized in their ability to work towards solving very specific solutions, kind of taking again that, depolarization of collective consciousness sort of approach. So I think that like if we're able to have significant influence in several different nation states with regards to how they treat health optimization and how they treat, depolarization of the collective conscious, like those are the types of things we want to build towards over the next 10 years. I think for me personally, like I just want to be surrounded by good community and people who are just wonderful human beings and that I trust and I can jam with and I feel like are authentic, and just being able to enjoy all of those things that you mentioned, right, with community and with good people around me, is definitely for me the priority and the goal. And I think that most of any personal wealth that I acquire will likely be going to support either that community or other kind of nonprofit initiatives that we end up creating. So I'm just excited to be living in abundance, hopefully in 10 years of time, but also being able to provide that to the people around me, and stay humble through it all, hopefully as well, with a couple of jabs along the way.
Thanks for ending with the jabs. If we continue to know each other, I hope I get a couple of jabs, critical jabs. Marik, thanks so much for this deep and rich tapestry and diving deep into the, I would still say, emerging ecosystem of psychedelics per se. Is there any last words that you want to make?
No, man. Thank you so much, Alistair. I really appreciate the time and everything that you're doing in the world as well. I see you kind of working hard on, all of these different important projects that are making the world a better place. So thank you for taking the time and having me on, and cheers to, building a better future. Excited to continue working together and making it happen.
Thanks so much, Marik. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, folks.